When I started at the University of Rhode Island, I started in fine art. That was very exciting because who should be head of the department but Fritz Eichenberg? So, I mean, how much better an introduction could you get to Prince than Fritz Eichenberg? He was wonderful.
This is Platemark. My name is Ann Shafer, and I am your host. You have reached us here at Series 3 of Platemark, in which we interview the wonderful people who occupy the print ecosystem. Today's guest is Susan Teller, who has an eponymous gallery that carries mid-century, 20th century, American prints, drawings, paintings, and even sculpture. My interest in Susan has several aspects to it. One, she handles artists who worked with Stanley William Hayter, who I have a deep interest in, and who ran a studio called Atelier 17. So there's a bunch of Atelier 17 artists in Susan's stable. But interestingly, many of the artists are women artists who worked at Atelier 17. So she's the go-to person if you want to talk to anybody about that aspect of Atelier 17 and see work by those people. She also works with a lot of artists' estates, and I really wanted to pick her brain about what do you do if you're the grandson of X artist and you don't know what to do with all of the things that are up in your attic. So stay tuned for that conversation. Okay, so housekeeping. I always like to make clear my positionality. It's only right. I identify as a cishet white woman, and I use the pronouns she, her. I record this in Baltimore, Maryland, the land of the Piscataway Conoy people. Any images that Susan and I talk about will be available to you over on the show notes at platemarkpodcast.com. Also over on the website are two things. One is an icon that holds a tiny little microphone. You can click it and leave me a message, ask a question. I welcome both. Also, there's a support and donate button. If you click it, you can sign on to be a monthly member at $5, or you can self-determine an amount for a one-time donation. It'll help me keep the lights on here at Platemark. It's just me over here behind my desk. So help me out. Just kidding. But yeah, help me out. Okay, I think that's it. Buckle up and here we go. Hey, Susan, it's great to see you. Thank you for coming on Platemark.
Thank you, Ann. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, of course. Can you introduce yourself for our listeners? Tell us your name, where you are, what you do.
Susan Teller. I'm in New York City, of course, but actually our current office is in New Jersey at Man of Fine Arts. So we're there a couple of days a week. And when we moved there about 6 years ago, we didn't think anybody would come, but actually lots of people come. So people are very welcome. We do need to know that you're coming. So I started Susan Teller Gallery in 1988. We already had electricity and all those things. And I had been at Associated American Artists working with Sylvan Cole. Before that, from 1973, again, we still had electricity.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about Sylvan Cole because I think that part is just super fascinating. But Mana Contemporary, people, I think if you're not in the New York area, you probably don't know what it is. I've been there a couple of times visiting another artist's estate, and I was just bowled over by the whole facility.
I know. It's 37 acres, three huge, beautiful old buildings. We're in the most northern building. It actually abuts the Pulaski Skyway, but you don't know that when you're in there. And it was the American Can Factory. We still have the old smokestack, and the walls are cinder block, which does interfere with things sometimes, but it's been wonderful. And during COVID and all this stuff we've been through, we felt very safe and secure there. There's no glass doors the way we had at the gallery. There's no big windows. We loved our big windows at the gallery over Prince Street, but every time there was a storm, we were terrified they were going to get blown in. There's none of that. It's very safe and secure. And there is an artist studio section. And then, as you say, there's the storage section, and we're in the storage section.
Okay.
And then there's a whole other section, but I don't understand all those things.
Well, yeah, there seem to be galleries and showrooms, and then the International Center for Photography has a library there, and I mean, it's just endless.
There's a frame shop. There used to be a cafe. I hope they're going to bring the cafe back. There's a dance studio. Those are mostly in the Newark Avenue building. We're on the corner of Summit Place and Day Street, which is really the the interior secret part.
This is all in Jersey City, so it's not far from Manhattan and accessible for those of us who are driving from southward
Mhm.
to kind of get there and not have to go into the city, which is nice. Do you have quote unquote showroom there, or
Not really. It's really a storage facility. And we've set it up so that our library is there, our desk is there, our records are there. And when people come, as long as we know that they're coming, we can have we do have a sort of a 6 foot wall where we can hang a few things. They had actually hoped that we would have a bigger wall, but we had so many shelves and files and things that we've used part of that wall. That's why it helps for us to know that people are coming because we really do have to arrange things.
okay? And well, so tell us what your inventory is like. What do you specialize in?
Well, we really are mid-20th century American. We go from sort of the teens. People like Peggy Bacon worked in the teens. So we have a few people, few artists that did go back that far. And we stop around 1960, which of course is such an important year for printmaking. And that's where we kind of break. There are exceptions, of course, but that's our main area. And we do paintings, prints, drawings, sculpture, all kinds of things. But of course, the most available and the most tradable, let's say, part of that inventory is prints because some of them are even at this late date, even multiples. So
Yeah.
that's great. We're so excited when we have we have more than one.
The thing that people should know also is that you are super heavy in women artists, which is unusual.
Well, you know, even at Associated American Artists in the 80s, when I say we, I mean I did a show about women printmakers, featured women as much as I could, and I continued to do that. Now I realize that in Soho, where we were, of course, for 26 years, from 1988 to 2015, the Guerrilla Girls were coming in every once in a while, and now that I know who some of them are, I'm surprised we didn't kind of get picked up because we did show lots of work by women, sometimes featuring women. We did a show called The Jersey Girls. We had Jersey crossed out and artists written over it.
Okay, so before we hit the Associated American Artists, which I think people will be interested in hearing about, when did you first understand that prints were a thing and that you were interested and would be good at them?
Actually, even in high school, I was introduced to prints and made a few. I prefer not to revisit that in any depth. And when I started at the University of Rhode Island, I started actually in fine art. So that was very exciting because who should appear to be head of the department but Fritz Eichenberg? So, I mean, how much better an introduction could you get to Prince than Fritz Eichenberg?
Holy
He was
cow!
wonderful. Yeah.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah.
So tell our play people who Fritz Eichenberg was. I think I
It,
know, but go ahead.
he was a master wood engraver. Of course, he was a German immigrant, and he was just wonderful and generous, and just he's a great, great American printmaker. And he was very, very generous with his time and expertise and his colleagues and friends. It was a very fortuitous place to be.
Did you learn wood engraving, or did you learn what was your preferred technique?
Actually, my preferred method was painting, but of
Ah,
course, then Fritz appeared, and all of that sort of changed. He wanted us all to be printmakers, so we all did something. Some of us better than others, I'm sorry to say, and also at that point, I was straying from the studio, and I have to be honest, art history was taking more and more of my time, and finally, I had to kind of admit that I really, you know, there was a difference between the real artists and me.
I think that you're not alone. I count myself among the same. I was like, no,
Maybe this interest could be channeled a different way.
exactly. I still have a toe in it, but I don't have to do
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah.
But in high school, really, like I didn't know what a print. Well, I mean, I probably had seen some, but I didn't really click into them till I don't know, probably graduate school.
Yeah, I think I was just very fortunate. It wasn't a particularly wonderful school system, but our teacher was very sophisticated. And there was a little art club, and we did trips. And she introduced us to printmaking. And although we did lino cuts, she did talk about the different systems. And of course, you don't really understand a lithograph, I think, until you're in a studio and you can either do one yourself or see at least that it's being made. She taught us that there were all these systems and that we felt comfortable asking about them and talking about them. And our museum trips, we would find them and point them out, and she would discuss them. So she was really wonderful.
I'm going to assume you grew up in the city.
No, I'm sad to say I'm from New Jersey. Yeah. And I went to East Rutherford High School. It burned down after I was there, so it's not my fault. And of course, that everybody knows East Rutherford because that's where the Giants play. But in fact, now there is a regional high school, and it includes, I guess, Clinton Hill. Is that the right word? And East Rutherford and our town, Carlstadt.
Okay. I grew up in Connecticut, so although we were the tri-state area, you guys seemed very far away.
We were. It's pretty far away.
Yeah, you had to cross the bridge or something.
Yes. And even Manna, going back to Manna, I think it's, as the crow flies, I think it's 4 or 5 miles from our apartment. But, it could take a day to get there if you're going at the wrong time. So,
yeah, it's a trick getting over there. Yeah. Okay, so then on to Associated American Artists, which was an amazing thing. And there's a wonderful book, which I'm sure you were involved with, by Liz Seaton, about art in every home, which, if you're interested, after Susan tells you about the Associated American Artists, you should go find. Okay, tell us about it.
I was so fortunate to fall into Associated American Artists. I mean, first place, Sylvan Cole Jr., actually, was there. I worked with him from 73 to the end of 83. I think he retired at the end of 83. I stayed 4 or 5 more years and saw the gallery move from Fifth Avenue and 52nd, 53rd Streets to 57th Street. So that was a big change. But working with Sylvan was just amazing. He knew everybody. He knew everything. He was an incredibly generous person, but beyond being generous, he loved artists. And he instilled in us the fact that the artist is everything. And if the artist says up is down and you don't believe them, then you're wrong, because whatever the artist says is the right thing. And that was wonderful. And of course, the gallery. Where else outside of a museum collection can you have the inventory and the variety that we had? We did a Japanese show every summer. We did an old master show with Jim Goodfriend every summer. We did new talent in printmaking. We were very, very strong in the American regionalists, so we showed them at least once a year. And anybody who came up with an idea for a show could just take the ball and run with it, and we'd find a way to get it into the schedule. We had a bigger gallery and then a smaller room. So I remember the first time I got interested in the artists of Union Square. I hadn't quite figured out their Art Students League connection yet. So I came up with this little list, and one of the people was Charles Keller, who was a college friend of Sylvan's. And I loved Charles, and they were great buddies. So I knew that I kind of, had a good shot there. And I think it was 20 prints. We put them on view in this little gallery, and it was just taking the ball and running with it. And that's what Sylvan allowed you to do. It was just great.
It seems like it was so much simpler. I mean, I know it wasn't, but like framing and all, like everything just costs so much more, and it's just so much more difficult to, put the things up.
It was simpler then. And in fact, I'm sorry to tell you that now, of course, we don't have the gallery. We're doing fairs, but even at fairs, I kind of use those same systems that I learned at AA, that, the mats have to be cut to fit the frames. The frames don't go to, and it might be the middle of the night, but you're in there, putting them in the frames. And, we had a pretty big staff. We had people who cut mats. We had people who managed all that. And of course, we did a lot of outside printing of brochures and postcards and announcements and that sort of thing. So we were doing all of it, but we were doing it. I think you're right. It is an older, simpler system, in that we could work directly with the printer and we could call up and say, oh, there's a last minute change, and they would just accommodate us.
Right. Was the earlier history of the Associated American Artists had to do more with mail order, right?
When I got there, we still had the capability of direct mail, either from our office or from a mailing service, to 80,000 customers, people who had actually bought things. And there were two women working with the mailroom, and they could key things as to somebody who had bought something, somebody who had bought something recently, what the price was, all done manually. I'm sorry to say. It was done on little metal cards, and it went onto a machine. Trays of these cards went onto what I called the clacketa machine. When I wrote about this for the AAA book, they wouldn't let me use the word clacketa. I don't know why. Maybe there's some language or maybe something else. I don't know. But anyway, you would hear this noise for hours and hours. When I got there, though, if you think about 73, it's a transitional period. A lot of things are happening. Brochures and mailing, that has gotten more expensive. People expected a slightly better quality. They didn't want the old little, thin paper things. And we didn't either. That was sort of socially unacceptable for us. It was that moment had passed. And also, mail had gotten more expensive. So suddenly the cost of mailing every single one of those got to be a concern. So we started condensing, and I was part of that group that was trying to figure that out, the kind of marketing effort of what's worthwhile doing. So there was a lot changing then. But up until my last day at that office, which was, let's say, April 1984, we still had all those metal plates when we moved.
Oh, my God.
So we had to go to a computer system.
Well, and there's a break between there and when we finally got all of our lists online and the ability to, produce catalogs online and everything. Like, what happened in the there was like 20 years in there.
Well, there were 20 years, but we still used a lot of the old systems. The printer was a printer that Sylvan knew and had used for 100 years. And eventually the ownership changed, but the family was still connected. So we used them literally for decades. We used them. And I eventually switched to a more computer-based company and got the gallery a little bit off of that older system. But even now, down on 7th Avenue, there's still that old printing neighborhood in New York City. And I go by it every once in a while. It was really amazing. It was really fabulous to be part of that transition from what they call hot type to cold type. I mean, all those kinds of changes were amazing. And that was for the 70s and then into the 80s. And by the end of the 80s, it was all different.
Right.
We really didn't set up our website until it's about 15 years ago now. Okay. We were not early on the website. And
because it's so much fun.
It's yes. Your life goes by, it floats by. And I have to say, I don't mind doing it, but I've never gotten into a real groove where I'm totally good at it or comfortable with it. I feel like everything just takes me so long and it's so tedious. And editing the pictures, that never gets easier for me. Never.
Right. Yeah. No, it's the learning curve on figuring out how to make a podcast was pretty enormous.
Yes, I can imagine.
I'm still trying to figure some of this stuff out. What do you mean?
Look, now it's history, right?
I know. Oh, God. Okay. So one of the reasons I want to talk, well, several reasons. One, I think you're lovely. Two,
thank you. I think you're lovely too.
Oh, thank you. You do work with people who were involved, well, and you handle some hater as well. But the women of the Atelier, I think, is one of your wonderful niches, and I'd love to pick your brain about your interest in that aspect.
Well, that it's so fascinating and it's so huge. But one of the artists who was important to us and was very, very dear, we did 7 one-person shows for her, for Fannie Hillsmith. And Fannie was part of the American Abstract Artist Group. And of course, she was part of Atelier 17. And I had come from from thinking I really didn't understand where women were comfortable. Let's put it that way. I knew that somebody like Dorothy Daner had been in Paris with David Smith, working with Hayter, and yet she was not working with Hayter. And I asked her, was it Bill? Did he not make her feel welcome? The best I can say is that it was David's place. They went so David could make work. On the other hand, I don't think Hayter said, "Oh, Dorothy, why don't you come anyway?" I don't think he did that. I think he accepted that it was David. And of course, the shops were still largely male. It's even now, it seems to me the number of women in Paris at Hayter before the war is still a small number, right? Am I wrong about that?
No, it is. Yeah, no, you're right by comparison for sure. But kind of an amazing number. Well, I don't know. We'd have to really like do a chart and compare numbers and do some data. But it does seem like I think he liked women in the end.
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
But yeah, you're right. You're right. It seemed like New
And
York was like,
yeah, yeah. And Dorothy made it seem like when they were there, Hayter was so welcoming of them and they'd have supper together. The three of them, David, Dorothy, and Bill, would have supper together. That was the way I came into thinking about Atelier 17. That's what I'm trying to say. So then you get somebody like Fannie, who considered herself a career-long cubist. And if you look at her career, you see it's running right through. Partly that was, I think, a rebellion because her grandfather and her granduncle were academic painters.
oh,
So I think she was naturally not an academic painter. She was a modernist. So she gets to Hayter's and she is a cubist. She's one of those people who doesn't use the swirling lines. She doesn't use the multiple tool. She uses lots of Hayter's tricks and innovations, but she sticks to her guns and I think has produced really a wonderful body of work that is distinctly Fannie. And yes, it's part of that Atelier 17 umbrella, but other people like Anne Ryan, for instance, when you look at her prints, they're much closer to the stem of the umbrella, I think.
mm-hmm.
And actually, the great thing for Anne was not the intaglios, it was meeting Schanker, who was there and could teach woodcut. And that was her great moment. So Atelier 17 gets so complicated for all these reasons.
That's true.
And of course, there's our great Sue Fuller.
Yeah.
And this is the opposite. Of course, what happened in Paris, you give them an inch, they take a mile. Sue Fuller shows up, trained at Carnegie in Pittsburgh, and she ends up being the master printer. So, I mean, that's fabulous.
Yeah, there's so many, and there's so many of them. It's nuts. It's just crazy. But what becomes clear when you look at not only that you were interwoven and that you knew many of them, which I find wonderful, is how many of their estates or families you now work with. And
right.
Yeah,
right.
which I mean, I know there are obviously a lot of dealers that work with a lot of estates, but I feel like you've got a lot. And I wanted to pick your brain about estates.
When you're talking about artists who are working in the 20s, 30s, 40s, as it is now, there's an artist known as Ket, who was at Atelier 17 in the 40s. And I'm wondering if she was even in New York. And she might have even been here in 51. I'm not sure. She goes back to California. She's our token living artist of that generation. So we've lost all these others.
Wait, Ket is still alive, is what you're saying?
Yeah.
Wow. Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow.
And partly it's wonderful to still have the work and still be connected to the families. But of course it's different. The closer, trained by Silva, the closer you can get to the artist, the better. If you knew Dorothy, if you knew Sue, if you knew Ket, that's wonderful. But that was decades and decades ago. So now we are not only working, in the case of Ket, of course, with her. She's not well, but the fact is she's still with us, working with her. And then the first generation that comes after her, whether it's their children or their nieces and nephews. And now we're in a situation where we are working with grandchildren. And, it's such a mixed bag. What works for some families. There are some families, let's say, for instance, Hugh Mesibov, who was a lovely, lovely man. And I'm working with his children, and they are gradually introducing their children to the responsibilities of the estate. But they were devoted to their father. They were there when he was working. They're so happy to share memories of the way he worked and when he made a particular thing, when they were there and when they weren't there. That's the good side. There's other families where it's just it's a financial arrangement. It's nice if it goes well. It's discouraging if they don't sell for a while. And they weren't that interested to start out with. And maybe they had expectations that did not materialize. So it gets quite complicated. I tried to balance all of that. And I have to say, really, I have good relationships with all these families. And if there's a point at which I think we're not really trusting each other, we're not getting along, then there's been a few times, 3 or 4 times over the course of all these decades, where I've really said, I think that I'm not the right person anymore, because if we can't trust each other and have a mutual agreement about what we're doing here, that's not ideal. So it's hard enough with the artist because you really want that to go well. But when it's so removed that you lose track of the artist, that gets difficult.
Right. Well, and if I come to you and I say, hey, my grandpa was a blah, 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 even if he was fairly well known, the market is not likely to be blowing up as soon as I say, Susan, please work with me.
Well, it's such a tricky thing. I have to say, for instance, for Fannie, when she was alive, she had a huge circle of friends and supporters that were interested in her work. The families were interested. And when we lost her, to a certain extent, we lost those families because their relationship with her was now different. They still loved her and loved the memory of her, but they kind of had what they had. So people who are buying Fannie's work now tend to be much more serious art collectors and not friends and family. So that's a nice thing that happens. On the other hand, we've recently acquired the estate for Albert Heckman, and that is a case of an estate being off the market for literally for decades. I remember buying Heckman's in Woodstock, New York in the 80s with a colleague from Associated American Artists. When I went back and tried to find that person and that dealer, it was gone. Everything was gone. And it's just absolutely fortuitous that we've re-entered each other's lives. And that's a case where the family is turning out material that hasn't been on the market, and there's a whole new appreciation for it. And that's lovely to see. That is so nice. So there's all these varieties of the way things play out.
If I am one of those grandchildren, which I'm not, if I'm one of those grandchildren, what are your best pieces of advice for them about how to manage it? Are there, obviously they need to, the list is the first thing, right?
Yes, the list is first. And along with the list are the images that go with the list.
Right.
And that's always tricky because really the images don't have to be great. It's get the list done. We'll fuss with the images later. And then an inventory. So it's the list, the images, and the quantity. And then there's your relatives, because all of a sudden the relatives think, oh, wait a minute, I wanted that one.
Oh, gee whizzers.
Yeah. And I always say, especially on my first visit to a family, I always say, if there's things that you are not releasing, please make it clear. I want to see everything. I want to know everything. But I need to know the difference between available and not available.
Right.
And it's a really tough thing because the person who might have brought me in is not the same person who's at the back saying, oh, well, don't let go of, the one with the green tree or whatever. So that gets tricky. And I've had the experience over and over again of going in, making sort of a selection. And then, Cousin Joe comes, and Cousin Joe always liked best the ones that I picked. Now, of course, honestly, Cousin Joe had never noticed the ones that I picked before. But I have validated the importance.
Right.
So I really try very hard to get the families to separate all of that before I get there. Otherwise, it's an exercise in frustration for both of us.
Right. What if you're sitting on a pile of a loved one's work that you don't feel there's much of a market for and aren't really I mean, then what? Do people just throw away these piles and piles of things? Like, what happens to it all?
Sometimes they do actually throw away. I think if you really have a pile like that and you have been to your relatives, then the next thing is to take a look at condition. Because often things that, you've got this pile, you don't know what condition is. So bring in somebody who can say, this is unsaleable. This sheet of paper is unsaleable at any price and should be destroyed for the good of the hobby. And secondly, what can still be saved, what can still be precious, what should be saved and protected, and kind of give them a tutorial on conservation, interleaving with protective sheets and getting it out of the basement and getting it into a safe, dry place. All of that helps. Then the next thing is, okay, there really is no market. Is there a donation possibility? What about your alma mater? What about the artist's alma mater? What about your local library? In the case of somebody like Baziotes, of course, is a much better known artist, but the town of Reading, Pennsylvania, has taken Baziotes to heart and now has a wonderful collection of Baziotes. The estate made a very significant donation. They've done a beautiful show. And Reading has applauded it and embraced it, and it's been fabulous. And before this, honestly, I would say 10 years ago, there really was no interest, or it was very, very minimal interest.
It's fascinating, the waves of interest and how, well, you can't predict it, I guess, that suddenly somebody like Drevis is the end all be. How do you have any feel for what's coming, or do you just sort of watch it? And
well, I think things do go in waves. And I appreciate that you said that, because in fact, my area, the mid-20th century, with notable exceptions, has really not escalated drastically. I think it's a very stable area. Nothing has really lost value, but I can't add the zeros it's shocking to me that people right out of school can make a print that sells for $900. They've got the entire edition and they could make a version in blue tomorrow. And I've got a print that I know is scarce and interesting and speaks to the period and is an historic document, actually. And I can't get the $900. Yes, it comes in waves.
It does come in waves.
I think there's just such great bargains left in mid-20th century. I really do.
I agree with you. Yeah. Having gone to the big print fairs over the years, it's been fascinating to me. Like, I don't know if it's just me noticing or there's like scuttlebutt, like which are the big priced ones. Like it was Sybil Andrews for a while. Now it's Mary Cassatt. And it's just $350,000. What are you talking about? But there it is on the wall in more than one booth.
Martin Lewis is the one that always I get a kick out of, because he was published by Kennedy Galleries in editions of 100. And let's say AAA, Associated American Artists, was publishing Thomas Hart Benton in editions of 250. And the Bentons sold for $5 and the Lewises sold for $10. And I think there's a lot more of the Lewis edition left, percentage-wise, than of the Benton editions left. And I think the difference is that the people who bought the Lewises, first of all, everybody loves Lewis. I mean, they're fun, they're charming, pretty girl in front of a lamppost. What could be wrong with that? But the fact is that people who bought it thought they were getting something special and precious and protected it and asked their heirs to be careful with it and protect it, passed it down, probably even mentioned it in wills. The people who paid $5 for Benton, I think they thought it was a throwaway, that they didn't think it would ever be worthwhile. Yes, it's Thomas. Yes, he's an important artist. Yes, he's an American who's made an international reputation. But $5 even then didn't seem like enough to make it precious. So they let them go. They let them, molder in the attic and weren't protected to the extent that the Lewises were.
I think that's fascinating. I
Thank
think
you
you're
for letting me vent about that.
No, I think you're right. I was having a conversation this morning with two gentlemen who are engravers, and one of them's kind of new at it, and nobody knows how to price, or they feel like they don't want to price their work too high.
Mhm.
So, I'm starting off like, well, I think you shouldn't charge less than $500, and they're like,
Mhm.
but I just sold one to my friend for 50. And so we're like at the it's like there is this point where people won't think it's as important if it's not, you know,
Yeah, if it's
not
yeah,
pricey enough.
yeah, I know.
It's
It's very interesting.
it
It
is
really
really
is.
interesting. Yeah, and because I have a nonprofit brain coming out of the museum,
Mhm.
like I hardly ever charge people to talk to them about pricing, for instance, or whatever else, and I can't seem to put a value on my own time and
Yeah.
knowledge and all that stuff. It's a problem.
Well, and it is valuable, and it does every time you have that kind of personal tutorial, you are not doing something else that could be more lucrative, for instance, if you wanted to. So it is taking your time and energy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I'm not sure I could be a gallerist slash dealer because I don't think, I just want everyone to love what I love.
Me too. No, we share that. We share that. And it's so nice when, when a collector says, that something has been such a pleasure for them. And it's just because there's enough art in the world. I don't have to have anything I don't like. So everything that I show are things that I love.
Right. Yeah, no, for sure. How much of your inventory do you own and how much of it is on consignment?
That's a pretty easy question to answer. Probably 95 to 97% is consignment. I own very, very little. I buy almost nothing. If something falls into my lap, I will buy it. If I need it for a particular project or exhibition or whatever, I will buy it. But I didn't come to the gallery world with deep pockets. So the idea of buying anything, not forgetting my training at AAA, the idea of buying something was just not in my bag of tricks. It just wasn't. So to make the gallery work, it had to be consignment. I have colleagues who own everything, and it's so astonishing to me that that's possible with very, very substantial inventories. But we don't. We really don't. There are a few precious items that are wonderful, but by and large, I feel like the gallery is a consignment gallery. That's why I can show a pretty big range for a particular artist. If I had to go into their home or their studio and say, okay, I've got, let's say, $5,000, what can I have? I would walk out, let's say, with 10 pieces or 20 pieces. Doing consignment, I can walk out with 50. There are lots of artists for whom I have 50 or 100 works on consignment.
Right. And the people who own their own inventory, there's a strata of dealer who work in the same sort of area that you do, who are looking at retirement. And then what happens to the inventory? Like there's no person like me who could afford to buy the inventory from that person and keep the gallery going.
Yeah, that's true. But it's an issue even for me because ultimately what I'm going to have to do is find a place for each one of those estates. There's nobody to inherit my role. So in some cases, the families will take things back. In other cases, I may be able to pass it on to another dealer. I think that's tricky because if you look at mid-20th century dealers, there aren't that many of us anymore.
Yeah.
So that's going to be complicated. So it is for everybody. I think if you own, actually, you're safer because you could just call up an auction house and say, come and get it. I can't do that because I don't own the pieces.
Right. Oof. What's hanging over your bed? Like, what's your favorite piece that you own that you have always wanted and you will never sell?
Well, I have to say I have a few Dorothy Dayners.
Oh, those are beautiful.
Yeah. I have a precious number of prints and I have a few drawings. And I tell my friends and my other relatives that if you ever see those on the marketplace, have my husband arrested immediately because something terrible has happened to me. He's trying to sell the Dorothy Dayners because, it's like, I won't let go of those. So I have to say, I have a soft spot for Dorothy. I have a soft spot for a few Isabel Bishops.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a few that are just really tough.
Yeah, I mean, I don't own any of the women Atelier. Well, the only Atelier 17 person I own, I think, is Hayter, but later, now more affordable than classic 50s Hayter. But yeah, if I could get my hands on a Alice Trumbull Mason or a Fannie
There you go.
Hillsmith,
There you go.
yeah, Mina Citron, I'd do it for sure.
Yeah.
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 We have a mutual friend in Christina Weil,
Yes.
who Platemark listeners haven't heard me talk about probably too much, but she wrote a very important book about women artists at the
That's
Atelier 17.
lovely.
Beautiful book. I feel like she really brought, I mean, it's not a new kind of way to look at something, but like this whole feminist take about how difficult it was for women to, make the choice between having a family and children and having a career. And it all, you can't avoid any of that when you're talking
Yeah.
about women artists at this time period in the United States. Like it's so obvious. And yet I felt like it took Christina to really sort of make it like, yo.
Now and I have to say, there are a few instances where she used a few of our prints. Our prints are the exact ones that she reproduced for the book. Just that was such a pleasure to have somebody look at an impression and say, this is the great one to use for the book. I appreciated that so much. One was an Anne Ryan. It was an abstract. It was unusual even in Anne's work. And Christina just, laser vision. She just found it right off and knew it was the right thing to do.
Yeah, that's a book that needs to be on everybody's shelf, along with Liz Seaton's book about the
Yeah.
Associated American Artists. But Christina and I have been talking about the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Atelier in 2027, and whether or not we could possibly get a project together. So, I don't know
Wow, that'd be
I don't know
wonderful.
how or what we're going to do, but we're talking about it.
It is sort of shocking. 1927. That's what you said. That's pretty fabulous.
I know. Yeah, the founding of the Atelier was very murky. As you know, the histories are not well kept in the early days there. And Christina and several other associates that she's been working really hard with, digging down into the early Paris years, I think they've pretty much nailed it down to October 1927. Yeah.
And it's
Ooh,
around the corner.
I know. It's nigh. Yeah, and when I was at the Baltimore Museum, I was working hard toward a big Hayter project, and it never happened because of the new director, who was not interested
Yeah.
in history, really. I mean, he was very much a contemporary person, which is fine.
Yeah.
It's his whatever. But it's like we were so far down the line, and we have all this great stuff. And one of the things that I've talked about in other places that I wanted to do online was to establish a family tree,
Right.
to codify like who was where when, but also so that in the future that somebody who is at the University of Iowa can put himself or herself onto the tree, so that you can trace yourself back through Lizansky to Hayter, so that you know what your H number is, how far down the
Yes.
road you are. Yeah, that was one of my plans.
And it gets so tricky. For instance, Baziotes, who we were talking about a minute ago, is always listed in the Atelier list. And here I am, a print dealer, showing Baziotes for, I don't know, 15 years now from the estate. And I had never seen a print. I couldn't find a picture. So it was always this mystery. Is there even a print? And finally, with this donation, this huge donation that went to Reading and the exhibition they did, there is a print. So, and of course it's a Hayter print, of course it was made at 7. So to tie those loose ends, how fabulous that would be if you could do that. That would
I
be
know.
wonderful. Really so useful.
I
And
know it
appreciate
would be, but God, what a lot of work. And how do you trace people who, came through and gleaned things, but didn't physically make something?
Yeah. Also, getting back for a second to the shop and mixed experiences, Isabel Bishop was an etcher. Okay, there was something called aquatint that she had heard about, and she didn't really get to aquatint until the 1950s. So that took a while. But she did show up at Hayter's, and she was using a tool, and somehow it wasn't the right tool, or she wasn't using it properly or something. And Hayter apparently reached behind her, picked up the tool, and made an H in one of her plates. And what? It was,
Yeah, exactly. What?
I mean, so, I don't think she ever went back. I think that was the last
Why
day.
would you?
But it's such a bizarre experience. He had so much to give and so much energy and so much time and attention for everybody. But, everybody's different. And in that case, it just, Dorothy actually didn't go to make Prince at Haters until she separated from David Smith.
Right.
That was what she had to do. And on her first day, she met Louise Nevelson and they were friends forever. So, that was great. But how bizarre.
My sense is that Hader is a particular kind of person, high energy, and if you didn't sort of jump into his swim lane, he probably wouldn't take to you quite the same way. Like, I think if you hit it off with him, you were good. I mean, I'm guessing here, but this is the sense I'm getting, because there are several anecdotes about people who are like, I'm never going back there, just because you didn't hit it off.
Yeah, they didn't hit it off.
Right.
And somebody like Sue, who was a complicated person, Sue Fuller was a complicated person herself. I could see where she kind of stayed a little aloof, maybe, from him. It was a job. This is what I do. I'll do my best, kind of a thing. I'm not sure there was ever sort of a friendship. I can't get a handle on that.
Huh. Interesting. The people that he became lifelong friends with, I mean, there's lots of correspondence around, right? You can sort of track the friendships and the Christmas cards and the whatever else. Part of the problem with my family tree project is that there are so many people.
Yeah.
But
it would be so worthwhile.
I know, but like to, investigate whether or not, what the connection was, or to really make sure that it actually happened, or, like the Baziotes problem, they finally.
Or is it just urban legend?
Right. Exactly. Were you really sitting at the table next to Miro? Probably. Can I prove it? No.
Yeah.
Maybe Christina could. She's a much better researcher than I am.
She's good.
Yeah. Oh God. It's kind of a dream that I have, it's going to just linger there till.
It would be, it's so rich, and there's generations. So it would be such a valuable thing.
I know. Every time I'm talking to somebody on Platemark, and they're telling me, well, I went to school in, Georgia or wherever it is, but the person that I learned from, was with Baziotes in Indiana. And I'm like, wait, hold on. And then we're like, jumping back in time. Like, and they're like, what? What do you mean? Yeah. Yeah. But he's everywhere. Like, everybody's tied to Hader.
He was everywhere.
That's my theory.
Yeah. And also I think that my introduction to Hader personally was through Sylvan. So of course I kind of inherited some of that relationship, that friendship that made it not that I knew him that well or that long a period of time, but when I did, it was very easy and comfortable thanks to Sylvan. Now I think, how did I appreciate it at the time? No, I really didn't get all of that. But that paved the way. So if someone can pave the way to Hader, a complicated person like that, how fortunate.
Right. I hadn't ever put the two of them together. That's interesting. Hader was busy touring modernist prints around, and the model must have come through Sylvan for that kind of a plan.
We published, at some point, AAA published a portfolio of prints, of early Hader prints. So I think Hader was very happy to have that financial connection.
Right.
Because not only was that a successful project, but it was at the beginning, I think, of the renewal of interest. Probably, I'm guessing 1980, around there.
That wasn't the death of Hector. No, that was earlier. I have to go look in the book. The catalog raisonné. Which actually, you've written a couple. Have you written a catalog raisonné? You have, haven't you?
I've done a couple, and I've done a couple of checklists.
Okay.
So for Dorothy Dana, I did a checklist that, I keep going kind of indefinitely as I still find things. When we did it, she was not well. Dorothy wasn't a well person to start out with, so that was difficult. But I'm so glad I did it, because even that basic list has been so useful. So I did print catalogs for Isabel Bishop, I recently did one for Angelo Pinto. That was a labor of love. That's another lovely, lovely family. And everybody in that family is artistic, and it's very nice. So then I've done checklists for William Smith, and I don't know, there's 7 or 8.
So our listeners may not know that a catalog raisonné is a chronological print by print by print in order of and how they did it and the states and the numbers and all of the information that anyone would need to say, is this thing I'm holding actually the thing?
Right.
So how you have to be pretty lucky to have access to an estate or a family to even embark on one of these things.
Very fortunate.
Yeah.
I did the checklist for Fannie Hillsmith, but I had access to everything she did. I had access to all her materials. I did for Dorothy Daner. She was there. We did that together, even though she wasn't well. In the case of Angelo Pinto, the family had very good records, and we had good impressions of everything. Even though there were a few impressions we had to get from a collector. There was a studio fire at some point, and a lot of impressions were lost. But a collector in Philadelphia had a few that the family didn't have.
Oh, wow.
So we were able to get them that way.
But even then, you had to know how to find them.
Even then. And the other thing that we used to make a big deal out of, which now seems so old-fashioned, we used to record all the places we knew you could find an impression. Because we thought somebody who's in St. Louis needs to know that the Mercantile Library has an impression, or the St. Louis Museum has an impression, so they can go there and look at an actual impression. Of course, now, why would you would just look it up on the internet, So.
Yeah. But I know you have probably played in the amazing Whistler catalog raisonné that the University of Glasgow did, Margaret MacDonald. They have every, maybe not private collections, but they have every institutional impression not only listed but photographed. So you can compare the various inkings of, the Nocturne from
was very active on that.
Oh,
and
my
it was an amazing project.
Yeah. I mean, whoo. Yeah, we hosted Margaret and Meg Hausberg in Baltimore because Baltimore has a rather mammoth Whistler collection, although it's good, but it's just sort of more voluminous than really good, But man, they were there for weeks. It was crazy.
Yes.
Yeah. But the other problem with catalog raisonnés is when a new one comes out and you are a cataloger like me in a museum, then you have to go back through everything and decide if you want to say, Teller's numbers are now superseding Mater or whoever.
Yep.
And then you have to recatalog everything.
Yeah. And I have to say, even within, for instance, for Isabel Bishop, we knew when we published the first one at AAA that we were missing a chunk of work. We knew it. And we just couldn't. We did everything we could. We had, I think, 2 years to work on it, and we still couldn't find it. About 6 months after the publication, which coincided with an exhibition at the gallery at AAA, she was poking around the front hall closet, found this box she hadn't looked in a while, and there were all the plates, including the missing. It was pretty amazing. So we then had, I think, an additional, it was a big chunk. It was something like an additional 7 or 8 subjects that we knew all along we didn't have. So then we're back to your situation. What do you do now? And there was, I don't want to use the word argument. That's such an ugly word. But it was a dispute. What do we do now? And I stuck to my guns and said, we're not going to renumber. We are going to add A's and B's and C's so that the time slot makes sense. We did actually change. I remember there was a big one date change we made. But basically the numbers that existed previously were still valid. And sort of until a few months before Sylvan died, we were still arguing about that. And he said, sweetie, I really think we should have renumbered. So I, of course, still think I'm right and he's wrong. But what can you do?
I mean, I'm all for order, but it is tough when every
Then
museum...
we get another number system.
Right, exactly. Oh, gosh. It's it's like, it's the minutia of the cataloger, like
Yeah.
I think listeners are like, what the hell are they talking about? But
Well, it's so crazy. We had one of Isabel's prints. It was a little 3 by 5 inch plate, and she had somehow got the idea she was going to turn it into an abstraction. So she made circles over the entire image, and for most of the project, we had that listed as a separate subject, and it was just sort of a few weeks before we went to press that we were comparing. I think we made a list of everything that was a particular size, and we kept coming on this too many prints that were size 3 by 5 or something like that. And that's how we found it. It
is
was
that why you were comparing by sizes to double check?
Yeah.
I would never have thought of that.
Well, I don't even know anymore why we did, but I'm pretty sure that's how we found that we just had too many plates that size. And finally, we figured out that if you looked around the edge where she had not managed to obliterate everything, that you could see that it was a plate that we already knew we had. And of course, all her impressions were so scarce. She didn't really make additions. The concept of addition was a little murky for Isabel. So,
well, it's a lot of work.
well, she had this little record. She knew she had printed 1 through 5, and that 30 and 35 was a common edition size in that period, and it was really. These are, I always say proposed edition because they never got to the 35. But if she went back to print, she didn't really know the last number she had used. So she would, give herself some leeway. Say, okay, I probably made 5, but what if I made 10? So I'll start with number 15. So you get number 15 through 20, and you're lucky if there's 10 impressions in the whole world.
I think Hader did that too. I feel like we had a 50 over 50 or something, and there was clearly not 50 of them anywhere.
Harry Sternberg, his edition size was 30. He almost always, it's not 100%, but even with the 30, if it was a lithograph that was probably printed at the League, he was never going back and making 30. It was too much trouble, and probably the stone had been ground down.
Right.
If it was an etching, he probably would have done that in his studio. Too much trouble, too much paper. Who's going to buy new paper for that? No, it's just not. If somebody wanted one, then you'd print a couple.
Yeah. Do you come across the plates within these families?
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes. And in the case of Isabel, before I left Associated American Artists, it was my job to get all those plates into museums. And I didn't really succeed. I never really completed the job. I just couldn't. We had started thinking that there'd be archives. We started with the Metropolitan and politely moved on from there. And we were lucky if we could get institutions to take 1 or even 2 or 3. We tried to be as generous as we could, but they all have to be maintained. And we tried to go to places where there were already impressions. In some cases, we were able to offer impressions. Honestly, the museums didn't want them. They had, really, how many study tools do you need? So plates are tough. Plates are tough.
But do you feel like that's changed? I mean, I know there are many museums that
there's more interest now.
Won't take the matrices, but
not enough interest to really make a dent in the number of plates that exist in the world.
Right. I mean, I think any student of the Atelier would be mad if they weren't interested in the plates. Just I don't know how you could not be. Anyway.
Yeah, but where do they go? Is it the museum's responsibility to keep these?
Well, if I were king of the world, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, the BMA has a rather unique and amazing set of Matisse's plates for the Poésie de Mallarmé, which he packaged in a whole maquette with drawings on the proof sheets.
Oh, how great.
Yeah, and it's amazing. And there's 29 copper plates sitting in the back and in these very fancy folios. Yeah, which are fantastic. And he's canceled them by doing little marginalia on them.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah. And so, they could never say no to me when I was like, I need a plate, because they already had the Matisse plates.
Right.
Yeah. Mrs. Hader was super to us. We bought an impression of one of Hader's prints from, I think it was 59, maybe 60 of Cascade, one of the Pollocky, drippy numbers, gorgeous. And I got Mrs. Hayter to give the zinc plate for it to the museum.
Wow.
Which is the most stunning thing, of course, because I love Hayter. And then the Ian Hugo estate was divvying up some things, and we got some plates from them, which were beautiful.
I worked with him a few years when I was at AA. He was lovely to work with.
Ian Hugo?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
He was elderly, of course.
Yeah.
And living down in NYU kind of housing.
Okay.
And he was lovely to visit. Talk about a foot into a whole other world.
Mm-hmm.
Just amazing.
Yeah, he's somebody that needs more looking into, I think.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, I think people don't really know anything about him except that he was married to Anais Nin.
Yeah.
Right. They don't know that he was a banker and he changed his name and he like all those things. It's crazy.
Yeah, the day job. But look at Hayter. Hayter, wasn't he a chemical engineer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it is amazing. Oh, what a world. What a world. Sometimes I do wish I could have blinked back to, 1932 Paris and hung around as a fly on the wall in the studio. Must have been amazing.
Yeah. And I think, how could I have let, that print go? Or why didn't I keep that with something else? But at the time we did the best we could, I think.
Right, exactly. Can't keep it all. Although I do say I would have been a better collector than dealer.
I probably would have been too.
Yeah. Oh, well. All right. Well, it's been lovely talking to you. We've talked for over an hour, Susan. Sorry.
Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, not at all. I could sit here for hours.
Well, I hope this has been useful.
Yes, it has completely. I really appreciate your time. It's been just lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Platemark. My interviewee was Susan Teller today. She's lovely, and you all should seek her out. She's a wonderful dealer and has been at it a long time. Thank you to her for being such a willing subject. And also, as usual, a thank you to Michael Diamond for the use of his original music. Please go to the platemarkpodcast.com webpage and click the support and donate button. You can sign on for a $5 a month membership, or you can sign on for a one-time donation of your choosing. It'll help us keep the lights on, and I appreciate it from the bottom of my heart. All right, I think that's it. We'll see you next time.